Think of the people you interact with every day. Would you want to spend a day in a canoe with them? Hi, I'm Nathan Mercero, CEO of Planning Alternatives. We're a disruptive brand in the financial planning space with a point of view that true wealth has nothing to do with money. Growing up in a small town in Canada, I experienced examples of families with money and without. It started me on this journey of understanding wealth and the idea that spending a day in a canoe with someone could be one of the best investments you could make. Join me as I sit down with leaders, entrepreneurs, creatives, rule breakers, and friends to discover their perspective of true wealth. And maybe you'll start to shift yours. Well, I'm excited today to be joined by Cate Havstad. Cate is the founder and CEO of Range Revolution, the world's first luxury leather goods company built entirely around regenerative agriculture and fully traceable American cattle hides. Cate, it is a pleasure to meet you. Before we hit the record button, we found that we have a couple of people in common as common connections. Kathy Wiseman, who was previously on the Day in a Canoe podcast, and Andrea Schar, who works with your mother, I believe. So welcome to Day in a Canoe. And I love how serendipity shows up in life.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. In the name of the systems thinkers, it makes total sense to be connected in this way. It feels very holistic.
Tell us about Range Revolution and how this whole experience and business model developed for you.
It all really can go back to the start of my careers in design and in regenerative agriculture, which both started in tandem in about 2013. And at the time, I was 23 years old, and I had started working on an organic biodynamic farm in Bend, Oregon. And I had lived adjacent to agriculture my whole life, but I did not come from a farming family, and I had not been actively farming myself until then. And at the same time, I had started my first company called Havstad Hat Company, and I was training to become a custom Western hat maker, which is a very niche trade. But the business took off. I had some early celebrity customers, and I really enjoyed the trade of making hats by hand. And so really those two careers had evolved for the past 12 years in tandem. The farm I was volunteering on, I ended up marrying the farmer and getting much more involved in the farming operations. And so really both those businesses, brick by brick, we built, and the farm started on 3 acres, and we now manage 1,400 acres. We've expanded from doing organic vegetable production to doing a lot more regenerative holistic grazing of cattle, transitioning hundreds of acres of conventionally farmed land into organically managed, regeneratively managed lands, and then really learning about stewarding ecosystems through extreme climatic challenges and drought and all the things that we're experiencing in this era. And Range Revolution became this very clear thesis that I could not deny working on, because as we were building the farm and the ranch, we had created a direct to consumer meat business to really drive revenue and support really our ecological stewardship. And what I realized in the process of building that meat business was that every time a mid-sized family farm or ranch like ours sends an animal to slaughter to become meat on the plate, only 65% of the carcass is getting utilized, and 35% is being deemed waste and is quite literally going to waste streams. That not only has ecological impacts, it has huge economic impacts, which is one of the many layers as to why it feels like we're seeing a huge contraction of viability of decentralized, mid-sized family farms and ranches being viable in this era. Being raised by a systems thinker, I just really started asking myself, what is one way that I can use my skill set to create the economic conditions that might make regenerative producers more economically viable in this era? And I decided that of that waste stream, the hides, which are going to the landfill, represent a very high value, a very valuable asset that we could turn into profitable materials to then funnel those profits back into the systems for regenerative ranchers. That's the gist of it.
Now, when you create something that doesn't exist, It starts with a mindset, it starts with a perspective. What were some of the learnings that you experienced along the way that, it helped advance things forward, or just as you were processing this when you realized there might be a roadblock or a challenge that wasn't expected?
I think back to the first hide that I tried to save was from our farm. And I have photos of myself, salting that hide with the youthful optimism and ignorance that I could do this myself at a small scale. These systemic waste streams are such big issues. They have to be solved at an economies of scale that make the materials viable for mass market adoption. This is not a small niche problem. It has to be solved at a volume that makes sense. We're not just aggregating from our ranch or our eco region. We're aggregating from a collective of ranches to reach volumes where, we're moving truckloads of hides. And also, I started with the thesis of building, our brand, our products, our collection. And that's not big enough either. And so, after a few years of developing our products and our collection, I realized we had to get to a volume of moving materials where we could wholesale these business to business to other designers, both in fashion and in interior design, in order to make this really work at scale and have the impact we seek to have. So we now have hides moving into our product as well as to selling these into the market.
We've talked about regeneration, and it's a term that's frequently used. Can you just unpack that a little bit more for listeners who may not be as in tune with what that whole space is about?
Yeah, regenerative agriculture really does begin with a mindset of how do we shape our management systems to create enhanced ecological outcomes on the lands that we steward. So, the context for each person is going to be different given your precipitation and the type of farming that you do in that area or the soil type. Some applications of regenerative agriculture that people are familiar with would be cover cropping or rotational grazing or creating pollinator habitats. There's a lot of mechanisms to create that outcome, but really regenerative management and regenerative agriculture, it's not about sustaining. Sustainable indicates kind of staying where we're at, and to be honest, there's been such a period of degradation of our soils that it actually is not enough to sustain. We must regenerate soil health.
Growing up in New Brunswick, Canada, I lived on a farm and near a farm, so I understand the importance of taking care of land and having awareness of seasonality and all the challenges. Farming is hard work. It's really hard work. How do you get through those hard moments of the grit that it takes to build a business while still maintaining that vision of an outcome? And I think a lot of entrepreneurs who are listening go through that kind of cycle of keeping the dream alive versus getting through the day that's ahead.
I come to a couple different points when I think about this. One, I do think about my ancestors and I think about who I come from, and I think about what they endured to allow me the opportunity to be here on earth with these modern day struggles and what they faced and how they raised their children without the sorts of resources and opportunities that we have. It sort of puts it all into perspective for me. So on those really hard days, um, I just know that I come from a long line of people who persevered. I also think that when your work is mission driven and you have a purpose so much bigger than yourself, the suffering is, again, it's put into perspective. I'm not a Buddhist, but like I do like studying some Buddhist philosophy, just kind of understanding that the suffering is inherent to it all and that you can hold the suffering and the joy at the same time is what makes it sustainable for me.
I appreciate that perspective as I've studied Buddhism as well, and there's some fascinating insights. So, if you could sprinkle pixie dust and it's 10 years from now, what is your hope for Range Revolution or what you're doing with the efforts that you're expending?
I mean, really, we're here to be a supply chain disruptor and to prove and to create these systems whereby sourcing materials from regenerative farming systems is not niche. It's not an altruistic endeavor. It is a good business decision. And I just know that that is the trajectory we are on, because any business which relies on anything that comes from natural systems, food, cotton, linen, leather, even petroleum, we are all living through extreme climactic pressures, and a good business leader who is thinking about not just profitability this quarter but profitability in 10 years is investing now in the natural system supply chains to make sure that they are more resilient, so that we have these materials given the increasing heat trends we're going to continue to see. And I just want to give an example. Regenerative agriculture can seem abstract, but I want to give you a really concrete example of what happens when you manage lands the ways that we do. And that includes with cattle. Cattle are often framed as part of the problem, and it's all about how you manage them in a system. They can actually be incredible co-conspirators in land regeneration. During an extreme heat wave in 2021, it was early June, and we saw sustained week-long temperatures of 116 degrees, which is absolutely out of the normal. Yeah, in that cycle of the plant's growth, be it grasses or any other plant, it seriously impacts those plants to see that kind of heat that early in its growth cycle. When we took soil probe temperature tests during that week, the land that had been managed with holistic planned grazing of cattle for 11 years saw soil temperatures of about 89 degrees on that day, where ambient temperatures were 116 degrees. On a neighboring parcel that had only been managed holistically for a couple of years, thereby the soil was still dysfunctional and on its way to healing, it had soil temperatures of 148 degrees. That's the difference of species survival and species demise. That's the difference between our food crops surviving heat waves or not. So I like to give that very tangible example of what healthy soils can do in the buffering of heat when managed regeneratively.
That's a great example. Thanks for sharing. I want to go back to your comments about the people who influenced you in your life and the perspective about generations before you, and I can say collectively generations before us, have done a lot to give us this moment in time. Where did that perspective evolve from? And you mentioned systems thinking, you mentioned the influence of your parents and family situation. What did you experience growing up, or what influences came to light to lead you to that perspective?
The two obviously most prevalent influences are my mom and my dad. And my mom, Laura Habstad, has been a family system psychologist who has studied the Bowen theory since she was 17, 18 years old. My dad, Tom Havstad, entrepreneur, self employed person, contractor, mechanic, um, incredible father and feminist and supporter of his academic wife. And so my mom, as a systems thinker who studied Bowen her whole life, I just think that my sisters and I were raised in that environment to like pull back and see the whole of things, to think about our place in the system and how we can position ourselves. It would be easy for me to look at the state of the economics of farming and ranching today and feel quite discouraged. I instead just take this position of like, what is my role in things and how can I influence the system as a whole? And I think that absolutely comes from the influence of being raised by my mom. And when it comes to my dad, he was an activist in his own right when he was younger. But there's a quote that he said, and I end up butchering it, but I'm going to try. It was a quote from somebody named Ira Sandpearl, who was very influential on Joan Baez when she was a young woman, and he studied at her Institute of Nonviolence. And essentially, the quote is, the ends do not determine the means determine the ends. And so I think about not just like what we're doing or what product we create or what business I build, it's about how we build it. And that becomes the center pillar around which we form our organization. And I think that is what we need in entrepreneurs, in business developers, in investors, We need that type of thinking so badly right now.
We share the perspective around the need for disruption. And I'm a big believer that when we challenge the status quo, there's a lot of available space for creativity and entrepreneurship. So in our world, we call it true wealth, challenging the conventional belief that the chase of money is all that matters when so much is available in life beyond money. And certainly money is absolutely important. It's a foundation for a sense of security. But that true wealth perspective is available to everyone and comes in different currencies. And each person can package their own currency formula in the way that they're choosing, whether it's focus on business, focus on health, focus on community, focus on personal development. There's so many ways to really explore true wealth. At this stage of life, what's your definition of true wealth? And it sounds like you might actually be living it right now.
I think right now my definition of true wealth is doing meaningful work that brings me joy. It doesn't mean that I don't suffer along the way, but that I find meaning in the suffering, that I get to work with people who inspire me and I enjoy working with. It is that my sons will have access to nutrient dense foods from safe soils and from clean waterways. And it is that, in 30, 40 years, I look back and feel like we were a part of redefining what is truly aspirational. I think that you and I share that as well. I think fashion is such an interesting medium to work in after having worked in food systems for so long, because fashion is all about aspiration. And we've been living through an era where I think that aspiration was defined more by status, wealth, power, or exclusivity. And I would love to be a part of redefining what is aspirational and what is true luxury and true beauty. That it's yes, gorgeous silhouettes, but it's natural fiber materials. It's not polyurethane derivatives on our bodies. It's natural fibers that come from regenerative systems, whereby those systems created better economic outcomes for the farmers and the ranchers who create those products and everybody along the supply chain. We have to do that artfully and beautifully. And so I hope that in 10 years or 20 years, I look back and I see that we have done that.
I think you're on your path to true wealth. Cate, I really enjoyed our time together. I look forward to meeting in person at Western Design Conference later this year. And I want to thank you for sharing your story.
I look forward to meeting you also in Bozeman at Western Design Conference.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a review. To discover what wealth means to you, please take our assessment at planningalt.com.